So welcome everybody to this very exciting international webinar. We've had people from all around the world looking to join, so we've got an international audience, which is excellent. We've got a really interesting time, and we will finish promptly at 10:15. That is in just under 2 hours from now. So that's the length. I'm David Jones, the chair of the Social Work History Network, and also involved with the Commonwealth Organisation for Social Work, which has a evolving project on the development of social work across the Commonwealth. COSWA is pleased to be supporting this event, which is organised by the Social Work History Network. Anybody who's interested, go to the website hosted by King's College London, and you'll find the Stephen Martinew's name and contact there, and it's free to sign up. Anybody is welcome to join. This event is international in that we have an incredibly esteemed group of speakers and panels. It's really exciting, and then thanks to everybody, and thanks to Karen Lyons and Frank Keating, who have both been involved with me in putting this together. Mark Henriksson is going to talk to us, waving there, who's in Auckland, New Zealand, recently retired from full-time teaching anyway, NASA University in Auckland, New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and is going to talk to us about his book, which is a really interesting read and well worth looking at. A huge sweep of history, which he's only going to just be able to touch on briefly in this presentation. So Mark is not only a social worker and very well known across the world, and particularly interested in diversity and human rights issues. All of our academics are also involved in practice in different ways, as has Mark been. But Mark's going to start off by talking with us about the history, and then in the second part of the session we'll come on more to look at the implications of history for ethics and the future. The panel will come in. I'll introduce the panel when we come to that point, and there will be an opportunity for questions and comments. You can put your comments in the chat, which is at the bottom of the screen, as you know, and I'll be monitoring the chat. But we hope it may be possible to have one or two people to speak, but we'll see how the numbers go. We're getting towards 100 online, so that is a challenge. So my request to you is to turn off your cameras at this point as we switch over and invite Mark to join us in the evening. As you can see from his screen, although that's a background, but the evening in Auckland, in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Mark, you're really welcome. Thanks for the book, and we're really looking forward to hearing you talking. So Mark, over to you.
Oh, thanks so much, David. That's actually dawn at the beach next to my house. So I think of that as a little bit hopeful as well. New possibilities coming with dawn. Thank you very much, David, and the Social Work History Network for your invitation. I note that there is a global audience, and that's only a little bit terrifying. I hope that we'll have an opportunity to engage as many people as we possibly can. I also want to thank the panelists, Prospera, Sarah, and Linda, very much for the care and time they have taken in and what they bring to what I hope will be a pretty robust discussion. The book and I noticed that there are some people here who have read the book and even reviewed it, so I acknowledge you as well. The reason that I wrote this book was because as I got more and more into neoliberal policy work over the years, it began to look more and more like a theology to me rather than a philosophy or political philosophy. And I had started to research the book, and then COVID So this became one of my COVID projects, which may have been quite fortuitous because it allowed me the luxury of spending a lot of time researching and writing online. Time is short, so I'm going to jump right in, and I'm hoping, David, if this does not come through clearly, that you will let me know. But I'm hoping that this it should now be showing on your screens.
That is perfect, Mark. Thank you. And can I just
Wonderful.
again ask that those who are listening to turn off their videos, which does make it easier all round. So, Mark, over to you.
Thanks so much. So I have given you a little bit of background about why the book. I'm going to be able to give you about 1.5 to 2% of what I'm hoping here, and I'm very willing to be critiqued on the book, but I'd rather be critiqued on what I do say rather than what I don't say this evening, because there is so much I'm leaving out in the interest of time. What I'm arguing is that European North American notions of helping, and I refer to that as the North Atlantic axis of helping or controlling poor and marginalized people, have deep roots in religious texts and traditions, which profoundly influence contemporary social work practice and social work policy. We like to think of ourselves as a secular profession, but I will argue that we are not, and that the values and assumptions that we bring to this are very much rooted in religious, and I would even go so far as to say Christian, and further than that, Christian Protestant traditions. And I will explain why I'm saying that. I'm bringing my background in social work and in theology together here in order to put them out, because I think if we can be transparent about where we are, we can think about what we want to keep and what we want to change. The paperback has just come out, and I would note that it's significantly more affordable than the hardback. So the presentation today is in 2 parts. The first part, I will go 20 minutes and then try to be quiet. And then the second part will introduce this sort of ethical context of where we are. So today I'd like to look at the origins of social care, and in particular, the Pauline verse on which so much seems to be founded: the one who was unwilling to work should not eat, shall not eat. Many of us were taught, I suspect, in our social work programs that social work started with the charity organization societies in the mid to late 19th century. And I would propose to you that our origins are much older than that. The story of social care begins thousands of years ago. And in fact, we're going to trace 7,000 years very quickly. So strap in, we're moving forward. The story of social care begins thousands of years ago in the Fertile Crescent, where power belonged to the strong, the elites ate and flourished, and the powerless worked to feed the powerful and relied on the elites to protect them. Widows and orphans had no one to protect them, so they relied on the protection of the powerful. Protecting the widow and the orphan in particular was the responsibility of royalty. In fact, it was a badge of honor. It showed the power of the person in charge, so that they were able to spread protection and their largesse and their support around to the community of people who needed care and protection, if you will. The earliest mention of taking care of the poor and the widow and the orphan, I'm sorry, I'm going to stick with that, the widow and the orphan, was about 4,000 years ago. And the best known reference may be in the Code of Hammurabi in 1754 BCE, which boasts of the king's power to make justice appear in the land so that the strong might not oppress the weak. Hebrew scriptures inherited this tradition and added the stranger, or the ger in Hebrew, to the widow and orphan who needed or who required and were deserving of protection. And this tradition was passed on to other Abrahamic faiths, including Christianity and Islam. You will probably know that Christian scriptures are divided into 4 Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, 21 letters by faith leaders, and of course, the book of the Revelation. that were selected and codified in the 4th century, 382 CE in the West, 692 in the Orthodox Eastern religion. Early believers expected their Messiah Jesus to return very soon after his death, which is to say within their lifetimes. Many believers stopped working and simply waited out the return of Jesus. And this attitude towards the apocalyptic divided the early church. In fact, the early apostle Paul, who traveled widely throughout the Mediterranean, wrote in one of the very earliest letters that we have from him to a church. And I'm not going to read all that out, but I will say that it's this: we command you to keep away from believers who are living in idleness and not according to the tradition that they received from us. For you know that you need to work. In fact, says Paul in that red letters there, anyone unwilling to work should not eat. 2 Thessalonians 3. It is this verse, 2 Thessalonians 3:10, that I propose forms the foundation of Christian charity and civic theology for the next 2,000 years. But, and I want to underscore that this is very important, scholars agree that this is Paul's instruction to believers to get on with their ordinary lives while they waited for the return of Jesus, not a condition of charity. Most people who stopped working relied on their neighbors to feed them, and this is what caused tension in the early church. And throughout all of his letters to Thessalonica, the Thessalonians, Paul is saying you don't know when Jesus is coming back. You cannot predict it. You should not predict it. You should not stop and sit around gawping, staring at the sky, waiting for him to come back. You don't know when that's going to happen, so get on with your lives. That's the context of his verse. Christian beliefs spread throughout the Roman Empire between 50 and 300 CE. Because believers refused to acknowledge the emperor as divine, they were frequently harassed, arrested, and executed. In 313, at the Edict of Milan, Emperor Constantine agreed to legalize, or at least decriminalize, Christianity in the Roman Empire. Constantine was from Byzantium, which we know as Constantinople or Istanbul. And in return for this legalization or to reduction in persecution, Constantine required the Christian church to adopt the Greek practice of philanthropia, which you may have heard of. That is a great word, euergetism, which is public giving. Philanthropia is public giving, and told the church, I specifically want you to care for the poor. That is your job, church, Christian church. And if you do that, I will make sure that no one persecutes you. And the church provided evidence of this care. And I want to read Peter Brown's quotation here because it's quite important for us, especially in social work. To put it bluntly, in a sense, it was the Christian bishops who invented the poor. They rose to leadership in late Roman society by bringing the poor into ever sharper focus. They presented their actions as a response to the needs of an entire category of persons, the poor, on whose behalf they claimed to speak. In other words, because Constantine had said, I want you to care for the poor, the church created a category of poor in order to justify their existence. And so they built the first poorhouses, the first hospitals, the first orphanages, and they were all staffed by monastics and religious. What's really important about this is that the church's theology problematized wealth, not poverty. In the First Testament, the Old Testament of the Bible, the scriptures say that God said to the Israelites, you do good, you obey me, and I will reward you. And rewarding was health, wealth, and many children. The church, the Christian church in the 4th century said, no, it's wealth that's the problem, not poverty. And in fact, The poor bear the countenance of Christ, and caring for them is as if you were caring for Christ himself. And Basil, the Bishop Basil, who's called the Great, proclaimed, the bread in your board belongs to the hungry, the cloak in your wardrobe to the naked, the shoes you let rot to the barefoot, the money in your vaults to the destitute. It was very clear that the focus of the church was on the poor, and that wealth was a problem. And giving that wealth away to the poor through the church was the solution to that problem. But all of these institutions, the poorhouses, the hospitals, the shelters, and all of that were designed not only to assist the poor, but to keep them out of sight, out of control, or under control, and to keep them from pestering the wealthy and asking them for money and embarrassing the emperor by rioting in the streets from hunger. Social assistance then was social control. But by the 5th century, a different kind of social control emerged. Augustine of Hippo wrote that resources should not be wasted on the followers of professions such as fortune tellers, gladiators, actors, and prostitutes. This was a different kind of social control that specified what was acceptable and what was not acceptable behavior. Now, there were lots of things going on all over the Roman Empire. It was a huge, vast empire, of course, and there were many different local practices, church court decisions, canon law, papal decrees, scriptures, and so forth, and things were going on differently in different areas. And things were not codified until 1140 in a document called the Decretum Gratiani, and Gratian is the author. And the Decretum became the guiding law for poor assistance and was taught at universities. And it set out the notions of deserving and undeserving poor. Now, most of us have this notion from the Elizabethan poor laws, but in fact, for Gratian, the undeserving poor were not the lazy, but people who had money and gave it up in order to be like Christ, and then demanded that the church, or expected that the church and the community feed them, even though previously they had been perfectly capable of feeding themselves. Those were the undeserving poor. It was not the lazy. And so this continued for the next 1,000 years. We've already covered a lot of time here, until the Great Famine and the Great Plague in Europe, and throughout much of recorded history there. There was massive social upheaval during the plague. The church lost its authority because it couldn't pray away the plague. It couldn't care for the poor since the priests were dying. Then its workers couldn't go out and harvest crops from the field. There was population migration from throughout as people sought food and care. It demanded resources. So civic authorities took over caring for the poor from the church, because the civic authorities could conscript labor, but they retained delivery of care through the churches. The first statute which became law was the Statute of Laborers in 1351, which required every person under 60 to work. It set maximum wages, not minimum, maximum. It forbade population movements, it controlled food prices, and it banned direct almsgiving from the wealthy to the poor. This became the prototype of poor laws in the UK and throughout Europe. We have to, because of time, we have to skip over Islam and the Great Schism here, which would help you understand why we're retaining our focus on the North Atlantic axis. But what happened then during the beginning of during the period leading up to the Reformation was that Roman Catholicism needed to raise cash for its massive building projects in Rome, specifically the Vatican and St. Peter's Basilica. Reformers began to protest the growing power of the papacy. And a key reformer for us is John Calvin, who was French but lived most of his life in Geneva. He called for a direct relationship between humans and God without the interference of priests. He said, everything you need is found in Scripture. And since there is no mention of priests in the New Testament, you didn't need them. Work and service were the means by which the faithful expressed their gratitude to God for their redemption. Calvin's notice of election said that only some people were predestined to be saved, and that hard work demonstrated to others that the faithful were part of those elect. You couldn't know if you were elect, of course, until you were dead, and then you met God. But through your hard work, you could convince others that you really were part of the faithful. Idleness and begging were banned in Calvin's area in Geneva. An accumulation of wealth was evidence of God's blessing, which is really important now because we're beginning to see a shift from the 4th century. Wealth was used to justify the exploitations of laborers, justify mercantilism, and eventually used to justify capitalism. And now we begin to see that fatal verse in 2 Thessalonians, given its more contemporary meaning. If you didn't work, you didn't deserve to eat. And this is where we begin to construct this notion as idleness. Just as a kind of quick aside here, in Lutheran-influenced Northern Europe, regions developed a community assistance model where there was kind of a community chest, which was quite a different way of looking at caring for the poor and the sick and so forth, and the older, than Calvin's system. And in Roman Catholic regions, and in particular France, Italy, and Spain, they continued their tradition of providing care for the poor through the church. Calvinism spread throughout Switzerland, Holland, Britain, and Scotland in their colonies, which is why this is so important, because of their colonial aspect. And those colonies included, of course, North America, which is where we see the North Atlantic axis being born, and provided the theological justification for entrepreneurialism, capitalism, and exploitation for profit and colonization. Poverty was now problematized and stigmatized. Remember, this is quite a different way of understanding poverty from what the early church fathers understood, who problematized wealth. Since the poor were clearly not of the elect, and they were clearly being punished by God because they were poor. We see a series of poor laws introduced throughout England. Calvinism was introduced to Tudor England. Calvin never met Thomas Cranmer, but they did correspond. Public assistance was secularized, but was administered through the churches and church wardens. We have punitive styles of civic relief. Poor laws criminalized begging, idleness, migration, poverty, and socially stigmatized lifestyles. Again, social order was maintained through social control. Calvinism laid the foundation for Western liberal humanism and individualism, because the individual alone became responsible for their personal salvation, not priests, tribes, families, churches, and so forth. A primary purpose of civic poor laws, and there were many during this time, was neither charity nor compassion, but the maintenance of social order through managing behavior and a reliable and stable workforce. 18th century poor laws in England standardized indoor relief, but these were for-profit institutions. An overseer got a certain amount of money, and anything that he didn't spend on his inmates, and there was almost inevitably a he, got to keep. By 1776, there were 2,000 parish workhouses in England. Where the poor were not stigmatized, they were punished, and where they were not punished, they starved. This is my last slide in this section. We have no time to explore the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, or slavery and blackbirding, which I think are critically important issues. But I simply want to tag and acknowledge them here. The British War against Napoleonic France led to a severe economic crisis in England, and in turn, a royal commission was established to review the poor laws. All of this commission was made up of Oxford graduates who were Whigs, and they all knew each other. And they pretty much had already agreed what they were going to do before they came together. The poor were held responsible for their own poverty, so the early church theology is out the door. Public assistance was no longer a right, it had to be earned. There was different kinds of workhouses established for different kinds of paupers. The elderly didn't have to live with the debtors, didn't so forth. National consistency was established, and outdoor relief, that is, relief in your own home, was banned. The idea was to stigmatize relief as much as possible and to force people into institutionalized care. Public reaction widely condemned this new poor law. 10 million people emigrated, private charities flourished, and assistance, informal assistance through churches funded by private almsgiving, began to emerge again, particularly in the cities. I'm sure you'll be familiar with the charity organizations, societies, and the settlement house movement, which flourished on both sides of the Atlantic. Christian socialism was the theology that underpinned all this reaction to the British Poor Law. And you'll know all of those names here. And what I became absolutely fascinated by is all these people knew each other. They visited one another across the Atlantic. This was a very intimate group of people. I'm going to stop here because the second part will take us into a more ethical approach. And I think I'm at my 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mark. If you could stop sharing the screen.
I will.
And then we can move over to our panel. It's if I could ask people who are not on the panel to switch off your camera just for a while. I will switch back on again later, but I'm really pleased to introduce our very distinguished panel now from various parts of the world. We have Sarah Banks, well known for her writing on ethics and practical ethics in social work, based in Durham University. Prospera Tidham has recently moved to Dublin from the Gulf area, where she's been before, well known for writing about diversity and inclusion and a whole range of issues related to that. Following a career in childcare social work and other forms of social work. And Linda Hahn-Smith, who's in Pretoria and well known for her work on decolonization and related areas. So it's a really interesting panel to talk about the issues that Mark has raised there. Noting that Mark's book has a much wider sweep, and this is just part of the discussion. But we're coming first, perhaps, to Linda. Linda, some reactions from Pretoria to that huge sweep of history where social work was.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much, Mark, for your incredibly rich and interesting work. It certainly is wonderful to read and listen to you. And so I tend to forget about what I want to say because I was concentrating so much. I've got a few sort of initial comments that I'd like to make. And as David said, my work does revolve quite a lot around colonization, coloniality, decoloniality, and other things. But I wanted to make a comment about the fact that these modes of helping and the social work, Mark, that you were speaking about, that we need to remember that the problem, I think, is that this social work was and still is universalized. It was exported, imposed, accepted in Africa, Latin America, or Abayala, as it's called by people living there, Asia, Australia, territories of the British Empire, and other European metropoles. And so I just wanted to sort of highlight the fact that added to the discourses that people had about these colonies as they were described as being discovered were seen as being barbaric, being backward, being uncivilized. Added to that was, of course, what we all know happened in terms of genocides, oppression, destruction. But what was so critical, in addition, what was so critical was that people's philosophies, knowledges, cultures were deliberately destroyed and inferiorized. And all of that framed as being benevolent and in the interests of those that were colonized. And then comes along social work in the more modern era, and the what is presented is almost replacing this absence of values and culture and philosophies that the people already had. And then, as Mark said as well, we need to remember that all of that was actually driven by mercantile capitalism. And the thread that I think runs through these very significant theological knowledges is how capitalism played a role. I would like to say other things, like about the march to neoliberalism that Mark describes, and how that impacted, and how it leaves social work facing a contradiction in not only the North American and European context, but globally, facing this contradiction between following state ideological positions, which we do as social work. We know that social work tends to follow whatever the state is practicing. So we have this contradiction between what the state is requiring and our own values and practice. Perhaps I could come in later a little bit about other than Western philosophical traditions and how we're at risk of appropriating those, and then a strong sense that I have about indigenization replacing what should be a global social work where all knowledges are indigenous, including Western and European and North American. And so dispensing with the idea that certain knowledges are exotic and attractive to the Western white normative perspective.
We'll come on to that in the next panel discussion, I think.
Yeah. Thanks.
Really, really important points there about the diversity of helping and informal forms of helping, which existed everywhere in some ways and need to be recognised. Prospero, would you like to come in with some observations from Dublin?
Yes. Good morning or hello, everyone. And thank you, David, for the invitation. Thank you, Mark, and good to see everyone here this morning. I was struck by, and it's just playing over and over in my mind, what Mark referred to as, the sense of one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. And I'm trying to connect that very much to practice, social work practice, where when we think about the assessments that our practitioners undertake with families, one of the things we often want to know about is their employment status or unemployment status, and how we might, in some ways, enable ways of earning an income of some description, and where that's not possible due to particular circumstances, ill health, etc., then we tend to try and find other ways of emphasizing just how important it is to have some kind of an income to live the lives that we would hope and we would want them to live, and that they themselves would want to live. And it's just that kind of thinking that I then was drawn to some of the work that has been done by people here on the panel and some in the audience, and certainly myself, thinking about the approaches we take to families in relation to this, and how we're, in some ways, aren't we replicating this in very different ways, but in a more modern way, using different terminology. We're encouraging employment, we're encouraging we're empowering you to go out there and find something to do, because that will keep you busy and that will give you meaning in your life. So I think that that's really stuck with me, and I think I will be thinking about it for the next few hours, and certainly through this presentation. So this idea then, Mark, that the history, what went before is impacting on what we do now, and will certainly move into the future, for me is really important. So what I will be taking away from here, and I don't know whether any of my students, I can see a few names that I know, if students are on here, we need to start thinking about how we approach these sorts of things. And unbeknownst to some of us, this is what went on before. We are now using a more modern way of ensuring that the families we work with are empowered to go out and earn and or work. And what are we saying about that? And constantly assessing how far they've come in the search for employment, or to make their lives as we would want for them. So I think that those are my thoughts, and I look forward to contributing a bit later on the topic.
Yes. Thank you, Prosper. And it's I think Mark's point is really strongly that if we don't understand where some of these ideas came from, how do we think about how we manage them in the world today? And these debates are live, current, topical issues in the American election, in the US, are live in many of our countries. To understand their origins, and then helps us to begin to critique them, and perhaps, as Linda was saying, to explore alternative ways of thinking about it. I'm not seeing questions or comments in the chat. And Mark, do you want to come back quickly before I come to Sarah, and then see if there's anybody who wants to put a hand up? If anybody in the audience wants to put a hand up and wishes to speak, we'll try and bring in. We've got 10 minutes or so more for this discussion. Mark.
I just want to say amen to Prospera. The notion of work as normative is that Calvinist notion which thoroughly informs social policy today, and that, if nothing else, that I hope we carry away. It's a religious notion, not a political one.
And the great interest, as Mark was saying, that we like to see ourselves as a secular profession, that varies around the world. I know some professional meetings I've been to in parts of Africa and elsewhere always starts with prayer. You would never ever have something like that in the UK, or for example. But so there are very different approaches, but these concepts, these ideas, and how they've evolved out of religious thinking is something that we need to explore and acknowledge. There is a question, Mark, from somebody in the chat. Can you explain a bit more what you mean by the statement, "The church created the poor"?
Yes, I was just replying to that, so I'll stop replying to that and do it orally. Yes, most people, in fact, of course, were poor, except the elites, and that was a very small fraction of society. But there wasn't a category of persons that we called the poor previously. This is Peter Brown's argument, and I think it's a very strong one, because by creating a category of persons, the church created a constituency and gave it a reason and gave it a purpose, where they could demonstrate to the emperor that they were doing good with a category of people, and therefore they could justify the emperor's expectation of a philanthropic expectation of the church.
I hope that was a response. Sarah, do you want to come in with some reflections?
Thank you. Yeah, I join the others in thanking Mark for that tour de force. I mean, it's an incredible sweep of history, and very, very enlightening for us to read that level of detail. And as Mark said, there's far more in the book. And I think the striking thing, which we've just been talking about, is that switch from, as Mark said in the chat, in the 4th century, the church was far more judgmental about the wealthy. So how it was with Calvinism that this idea of blaming the poor, as it were, and wanting to generate wealth, leading to the capitalist approach and the stigmatization of the poor and all that follows, I think is a very interesting turning point, which maybe certainly I wasn't aware of that link, which I think is very important for us to be aware of. And I think probably it's best to let other people come in, because there's a few more questions in the chat, and I'm going to say a bit more in the second half. So maybe, JB, would you like to take some more of these comments from the chat?
Yes. Thank you. People are making sort of statements in the chat. If everybody wants to put their camera on now, if you feel you're interested and you want to be seen in joining the conversation, feel free to do that for the next few minutes, and then we'll be taking a break in 10 minutes or so. Jackie, do you want to come in, Jackie Moore, and make your points? I see you in the chat there, Jackie. Yes, hello.
Hello. I'm not sure whether you can see or hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, when I was lecturing in social policy to social work students, you know, you can draw threads very much from the history into present policy, particularly people on the right of the political spectrum. I remember, I mean, it's some years ago now, but being quite shocked at really the links between our poor laws in 1830s, but also the Tudor ones, and how, you know, people like, you know, well, I could name some of our politicians. It was just as they were speaking today.
That's true. I see Chaitali Das has made posed a question. I don't know if you're there and want to put it yourself. Chaitali, do you want to?
Hi. Hi.
Go for it. Where are you?
I'm in Germany. I'm in Frankfurt.
Okay, welcome.
And I was just wondering, when we're talking about histories, you know, in the late late 1800s, early 1900s, when the whole profession of social work, so-called, become the profession and really gets this you know, drive to kind of create itself as a profession. There's this historical record that talk about the social systems was also provided in the colonies, but more to make sure that they're able to continue working to produce, you know, labor force for this capitalistic production. And I was wondering whether this notion of, you know, it matches what you talked about, Professor Hendriksen, about, you know, making the poor able and fit so that they can produce capital in that sense, or fit into the capitalistic system. But I was just wondering, was this treatment of the poor in the colonies in any way different from the treatment of the poor in the home country, so to speak, in the European continent? Or was it the same? Or in what ways was it similar or different? I'm sure there are continuities, but I was just wondering, how would you see it? I was curious to know about that. Thank you.
Mark, interesting question. Your mouth has dropped open, but we can't
My
hear.
mouth was about to speak, and then I realized I was muted, and I was waiting for the dreaded "you were on mute," so I stopped myself. I was just making a comment here. We just did 7,000 years in 20 minutes, so it is necessarily high level. It's very high level. However, I would address exactly those things in the second half. So if I could ask you to hang on to that for just a moment. It was these ideas were spread through the Dutch and the British East India companies. The Dutch in particular spread the Calvinist notions, of course, and the British, of course, wanted their version of social control. And that's why I end up focusing so much on the North Atlantic axis, because it was there that we see colonization going out and imposing and hegemonizing communities and populations in this way. And it's no coincidence that missionization accompanied those mercantile enterprises.
Yeah, of course, there's a lot of description and analysis of the links between colonialization and missionary activity and so forth, and issues which are still going on today. We have a few minutes, and Paul, I see Paul Dolan's question. We'll come on to those questions, I think, in the next section, Paul, but come back with a observation later if that's what you feel. It's quite interesting to look at the Royal Commissions in the Caribbean in the 1920s and 30s, I think, which are an interesting example of where the application of these concepts in a particular colonial setting. We explored those in an earlier webinar, which is online. If anybody's interested to go back into our archive, it's there. Stefan has just made a comment. I think we're going to come on to talk a little more about Indigenous perspectives. And of course, this then raises issues around the structure of the human rights instruments that we have in the world. The Declaration of Human Rights is strongly influenced by some of the ideas that Mark has been talking about. And that's now become a point of contention, which again, we might discuss in the second half. Michael Lambert. Michael, do you want to come in quickly on your point in the chat?
Well, thank you. It's only very, very briefly that in terms of tracing, I suppose, these very long-standing and ancient historical concerns right the way through to the more recent past, in a way that after the Second World War, there was so-called colonial development and welfare legislation, whereby, particularly under the Attlee government, and successors, they were trying to take a lot of the British welfare state thinking that was emerging at that time and impose it in a slightly differently, obviously in the different kinds of parameters, but in a colonial setting in a way that perhaps historically until that time had always been kind of a differential treatment that, particularly in India, for example, a lot of the health, welfare, insurance services around white occupants and colonizers were distinct in terms of the indigenous population, whereas after the Second World War, obviously not in India with independence, but in other colonies, there was an effort to try and bridge that as part of an effort, kind of a face-saving element in terms of the earlier point made about social control, and you can see that in exactly the same sort of expanses. So in the terms of understanding the British welfare state, you can't have that without these kind of wider colonial dimensions as well. So just kind of bring it to my sort of world in the 20th century. That was all.
Interesting connection. And Michael's a speaker in the Next History Network webinar with June Thoburn and Marion Brandon, looking at neglect in June. But we'll come back. Mark was saying we pick up comment from Carol about Carol Harris about children and babies. Mark, do you want to come back on that? And I haven't picked up the.
I wonder if Carol's here, willing to speak to that.
Yes, Carol, I see your question now.
Yes.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, my thing is I'm the historian for Coram, which used to be the Foundling Hospital, and I'm just interested in when did it start to be seen as kind of visiting the undeserving, deserving idea onto children and babies. It seems that's certainly a long history in this country in terms of whether children are themselves sort of undeserving, deserving, or whether it's about their mothers being sort of described as deserving, undeserving, and therefore it's okay to kind of filter out their children from access to social work and support and charity, and in that sense.
I've not done a lot of work with children, but I do know how the children of, and I'm using this term very judiciously, women of ill repute were treated, and the children have that visited upon them, and I think there's a theological component to that too. But if you're the historian, perhaps you could say something. Perhaps you have an idea about this.
Well, I suppose really I'm thinking about a lot of it in terms of where we are today, in that, and the parallels there are then, where you have the Foundling Hospital, for example, in the 1740s, at first has a no questions asked, very strict policy of no questions asked. And when they've filled the number of places they have when mothers bring their babies there, that's it. And then around about, well, by 1763, I think it is, you start having mothers have to petition to make their case as to why their children should be accepted. But in that context, you still have this idea that is kind of pushed to the side, that there is a child there, a baby, who has done nothing about creating their situation except being born, which they hardly have any control over. And we kind of see it now in that, I suppose I see it going right the way through, in that there's this idea of we can filter out and justify not helping a baby in need in some way to control the numbers, control resources. I mean, we see that now here in terms of the 2-child policy. We see that in terms of huge cuts, massive cuts that have gone on in recent decades, mainly, we have to say it, from Conservative governments. And yeah, the increase in child poverty in recent years has been somehow socially acceptable, because, well, you know, it's kind of stigmatizing children in the care system. It's stigmatizing those who want to access the care system.
And a huge and really important issue, and hugely politically significant. I'm just conscious now we're running into our break time, but Mark, a quick comment and then we'll take a break.
Very quick. I cut my social work teeth during the HIV epidemic, and the language of innocent victims versus presumably guilty victims who are the adults, the innocent victims being the children. And I'd love to see some work, and perhaps it's been done, it's not my area, so I don't know, about the children, the sins of the mothers being visited on the children versus this innocent victim narrative. I think that's a really interesting tension.
Which is a moment to reflect and pause and take a break.